Hello, everybody from sunny Helsinki over here to all of you over these virtual highways, wherever you may be. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel on successful governing in an age of complexity, where we'll be looking at humbleness today as a new vision for governing. As we all know, the 21st centuries that governance is facing and societies are facing today are indeed very complex, from ecological crises to political polarization to perhaps even bigger economic crises on the way. These are all things that governments, progressive ones as well, have to face in the coming years. This is indeed a decade of change that we are facing. And in order to get those transformational politics in place, we of course also need transformational governance that is capable of delivering on those changes. Today on this panel, we'll be looking at the concept of humility and humble governance, and whether this sort of humbleness could be a key, a vision into tackling some of these very complex problems that our governments are facing today, and if it could be seen as a virtue for politics and for governance in the 21st century. My name is Johannes Anttila. I come from the think tank Demos Helsinki, where I am a senior expert on governance innovation. I'll be guiding you, the audience, as well as our wonderful panelists today throughout this discussion, 1 hour and 15 minutes, where we'll be diving into humble governance presented by my colleague from Demos Helsinki, Silva Mertsola, also working on governance innovation. And we'll be joined by other panelists who will give us a view from the United States, New Zealand, Portugal as well, and echo Silva's presentation. In addition to Silva, we are also joined here today by Professor Nina Hall, who is an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Dr. Tiago Antunes, Secretary of State, Assistant to the Prime Minister from Portugal, and Emily Tampion, who is the US editor of The New Statesman. Hi all, and welcome to you as well, panelists. We'll be going forward in the following way. My colleague Silva will first present the concept of humble governance, a concept developed which aims to restore capacity of governments to solve some of these complex issues and problems. And after Silva's presentation, we'll turn the mic over to the other panelists who'll be giving comments and reactions, and we'll hear from them what sort of innovative and successful governments and governance is doing in their respective countries, as well as hearing a bit of echoes onto Silva's presentation on humble governance. So we have a full hour and 15 minutes ahead of us. We'll be talking here on the panel. I'll be facilitating the discussion, but in addition to that, we of course want to hear from you, the audience. So you are very much encouraged to pose questions or comments throughout this whole thing. I'll be saving a bit of time at the end, so we also have ample time to jump to your questions and to your comments. So just post them in there, and then we'll get back to those at the end as well. I hope too that the audience, that you'll have a wonderful time. I'm sure that we on the panel will as well. But without further ado, I give this virtual speaking stage to Silva, please.
Thank you. Give me 2 seconds. I will hijack the screen here. Okay, classic questions. Are you seeing my screen? Yes, you are. Nice. So hi everyone, my name is Silva Mertsola. I work as a consultant at the think tank Demos Helsinki. We're based here in Finland, but we have operations in many different countries. During the past year and a half, I've been on quite a journey with the Finnish Prime Minister's office that has resulted into what we today call the humble governance model. So I will briefly walk you through the background, the very simple version of this model, and explain how it has been previously applied to a very, very progressive policy in Finland back in the 70s, namely our primary education system. Before I go into describing the model itself, I want to open up the background of where this all started. we were asked by the Finnish Prime Minister's office to do some thinking on how the government needs to readjust its steering mechanisms and how it conducts governance, because we currently have a very progressive government that has some very ambitious policy goals. And these policy goals are aimed at trying to solve some of the biggest problems of our time. So we're trying to achieve carbon neutrality by 35. We are working hard to halt the decline of biodiversity in Finland, and we're really trying to do some reforms in our labor market to ensure that we have, for example, lifelong learning in place for future generations. So on the one hand, we have very progressive and ambitious policy goals, but on the other hand, we have a public administration and a government that has some severe problems. One of the main problems is a culture of infallibility. So there's very much a culture where people are demanded to give the right answers right away. We are struggling with some severe silos in our administration that is making it difficult to assess these issues as phenomena. We have institutionalized short-termism. Naturally, that's a part of democracy, but at the same time, we need to be able to address problems in the very long term. And then finally, we have a very scattered knowledge base where information doesn't flow, and information, for example, from the municipalities to the central government isn't moving as it should. So this was the background that we started with. And we collaborated with Professor Charles Sabrel from Columbia Law School to use his theory of experimentalist governance. So we have for a long time been working with policy experimentation, and we were familiar with that. And we now wanted to see whether this notion of experimentalism could be elevated up to the governance level. But we thought that experimentalism isn't the best way of describing what this is all about. And therefore, we came up with calling this humble governance. So quickly to talk about what we mean when we talk about humility. Our assumption is that no politician, no government employee or government entity can alone harness and analyze enough information that is needed to solve some of the biggest problems of our time. So we really need a government that is willing to do humble problem solving, which means that the government acknowledges that it alone doesn't hold all the answers to these big problems. Well, then we also need a mechanism for collaborating broadly with society. So when we're talking about climate change, we need new mechanisms for involving companies. We need to be able to collaborate with the civil society and to really solve problems in those places where those problems are most pressing. And then thirdly, and what has been maybe the most radical part about this theory has been our notion of humble decision making, where we're really calling for our decision makers to be able to collaborate with the opposition as well. So in order to have policies that last longer than one mandate period, we need to find new ways of collaborating between the government and the opposition. So that's another notion of humility that we're calling for here. This is what the humble governance model looks like. We have 4 components that all need to be in place in order for this kind of governance to function. If we start with point 1, we talk about having a thin consensus. So we are arguing that problem solving can be initiated when we at the political level have a shared understanding of a problem statement and a shared understanding of where we are heading. So instead of saying that we need to have full agreement of how a particular problem is to be solved, we can already start working once we have set so-called broad framework goals. So we have an agreement on the broad issues, but we leave politics out from really steering the details about how to reach a particular goal. An important mechanism in this model is that problem solving is devolved to local level stakeholders. That means frontline employees, civil servants, that means companies, it means the civil society. So whoever really works with a particular problem should be included into this problem-solving mechanism. And to do this, we need to have very smart incentives. So it's not enough to simply give an economic incentive for someone to join in on humble problem solving, but there needs to be intelligent incentives that deploy these kinds of penalty defaults. So non-compliance actually has some quite severe consequences for the people who decide not to participate. So when we have broad framework goals at the political level and quite substantial local autonomy, we need to really rethink the way feedback mechanisms work. And here we're arguing that instead of doing what we do nowadays, which is a relatively arbitrary reporting from people up to the governmental level, we should start using so-called peer learning mechanisms, where we really use dialogue and deliberation to bring people together to exchange information. And then based on this information that is gathered from local levels, we need to have politicians who are willing to commit to revising these framework goals. So saying that we were heading this way, we have new information, we have learned, and hence we will, for example, tighten the deadline for carbon neutrality or revise the framework goal in some other way. So this is what the model looks like at its simplest, at its high level. There are many technicalities within this, but let's not get into those. But what is important to say here is that humble governance is not a new shiny thing that we have come up with at Demos Helsinki, but it's actually hidden in plain sight. So there are many examples of governments and institutions who have landed at this kind of an architecture quite organically. For example, the Montreal Protocol which is, one could say, the most successful global climate governance mechanism, is very much following the logic of this kind of a governance mechanism. And another case which we've been doing a lot of research on is the Finnish education system, which is naturally close to our heart because both Johannes and I have gone through the Finnish primary school, and it's something that is discussed very openly and celebrated. So the Finnish education system is based on a system where you, at the political level, only set a very broad framework goal in the national curriculum. So politicians stay outside of thinking about how exactly to conduct teaching in our schools. So that's the consensus at the political level. And then teachers at classroom level are giving substantial autonomy to decide how they want to implement the national curriculum. So you have framework goals here and highly educated teachers with a lot of autonomy who then conduct teaching in whichever way suits them well. This system then has very strong peer learning mechanisms, so teachers are brought together to exchange information about what works and what does not in their classrooms and in their municipalities. And this information is then used to revise the national curriculum periodically. So we ensure that the information from really those people who know most about education is used all the way at the political level. And what's interesting about the Finnish education system that we often forget is that this was highly politicized back in the 70s and prior to that. So there was a very thin consensus on the idea that yes, we need to educate our population in the 70s. Finland needs to get to the track of economic growth and develop as a society, but there was no agreement on what exact model it would be. But through these kinds of local governance models where municipalities got to test different alternatives and where this was implemented relatively slowly and through a very experimentalist process, we started seeing good results from the Finnish education system. And today, if you ask politicians, there's no one that questions the value of free universal primary education in this country. So we've moved from something that was highly politicized, relatively even polarized at the moment, towards a very successful system where there is high levels of autonomy. And the thesis that we have is that evidence shows that these similar kinds of models can be applied to other policy issues that are highly complex, so where we really can't design our way out of it and we don't have the perfect solutions at hand, and to situations where you have different levels of political polarization or gridlock and where politicians really need to find the lowest common denominator and then start working from there towards more specific targets. So that's humble governance in a nutshell. I'm very happy to hear your thoughts about this and to discuss it further, and we can go into the details or stay at the more philosophical side. But that's humble governance. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Silva, for presenting that in a nutshell. I'm sure that we'll get to go dig deeper into those things as well. Now, turning to our other panelists, Nina, let's start with you. You have done a lot of research. You're currently writing a book on transnational advocacy and the digital era, which is, of course, a sign of polarized times as well. But in addition to your research, you've also worked in government as well. So I'm sure that you also know these problems that Silva was describing through that context as well. But from your point of view, how does the humble governance sound like? And from like a New Zealand perspective, then how are challenges how can we solve these kinds of challenges?
Great. Well, thanks, first of all, for having me on today's panel. It's a real delight. I am a New Zealand citizen. I worked briefly at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, so my expertise is more in the international affairs realm. I guess at first glance, like many of the listeners, I'm relatively new to this framework, so I'm sure I'm missing a lot of depth of it. But I think in the New Zealand case, maybe humbleness isn't the key attribute that contributes to good, effective, and progressive governance. I say this for a couple of reasons, and I think Emily's probably from the US going to say something quite different. So I will note this is very much around New Zealand's particularities. New Zealand has a quite strong tall poppy syndrome, which means we like to cut down anyone that gets too high above the crowds. We don't like people to excel. I think the US is quite the opposite. So actually being some of the things you mentioned at the beginning, Sylvia, about why you need to develop this approach of people being afraid of acknowledging their own failures. I think in New Zealand, I mean, that can always be a part of the problem, but I think part of the bigger issue in New Zealand is about being bold and strong. And I say that also because and this is my second point, the key moments where I think New Zealand has really stood out to the world have actually not come from being humble, but from being quite provocative and bold. So I'll give you two case studies of that briefly. One is the nuclear-free moment. So in 1985, our Prime Minister, David Lange, came out, pushed, I should say, by social movements, that was very important, to be nuclear-free. And this was an important declaration for New Zealand because essentially it meant that our major security alliance with the US and with Australia, which was a post-World War II security alliance, we broke it off. So we broke off our relationship with the US. I wouldn't say that was humble, that was pretty provocative, it was pretty strong. We lost access to Pearl Harbor, as in our military ships could no longer berth in Hawaii. So New Zealand was not seen as a friend. But yet this was a very important moment, and I would say as a bipartisan accepted policy, and it came precisely from being bold and quite strong and provocative. The second example, which I'll mention briefly because I'm sure your listeners are more familiar with it, is COVID-19. New Zealand's been at the top of the Bloomberg COVID resilience tables until pretty recently for Jacinda Ardern, our current Prime Minister's strong position. She took the position of going fast and early in March to close the borders. Only New Zealand citizens can return and must do a compulsory 2-week quarantine. And there was a very harsh lockdown. There were obviously a number of other measures that went into that, contact tracing, but essentially it was closing down the borders, very harsh, strong and stringent lockdown, which meant that New Zealand got rid of community transmission of COVID-19 and essentially haven't really had many cases for days, for months. So New Zealand in the last 10 months, or 12 months now, like most of the rest of the world, has essentially been COVID-free. Now, these are two examples where I think it wasn't about being humble, it wasn't about being slow, it wasn't about consulting the opposition. You know, if New Zealand had consulted the opposition on COVID, we probably wouldn't have done that. So these may stand out. And I think, as I say, I'm happy to be checked on how the humble governance might inform New Zealand politics. But I think there are a couple of examples where maybe it doesn't fit so easily. Thanks.
Thanks, Nina. I'm sure that we'll get to those in the discussion as well. I was just wondering, I think the examples that you mentioned were kind of transformative policy choices and kind of bold policy choices. I think Silva in her kind of opening was describing subject matters or policy matters that are very polarized and that have this sort of like tension within like government opposition tension, but also maybe sort of societal tensions that prevent politicians from making those sorts of choices. So do you see in New Zealand or other experiences of kind of tackling these sorts of really polarizing policy matters and how that is being tackled?
Sure. I mean, I would push back a little bit just because I think now looking back, it seems obvious that New Zealand made the right choice, but there were a lot of voices and people saying, no, this is the wrong thing to do, or we should open up earlier, or, you know, this is hurting our economy. So these were, just as in Europe and just as, you know, we've all been living through for the last year, this constant, should we lock down more? Should we open up more? I mean, the same debate was happening in New Zealand. So I think it would be easy to say in hindsight, that wasn't easy. It was a good decision. It was bold. They did the right thing. It was, I'm sure, a very difficult decision, because remember back in March, we had very little information. And in a way, you could always argue it's better to wait, see what happens before you do anything dramatic. And I think same with the nuclear free. While now there's a very strong support for that position, I think at the time, there were some who were arguing strongly for going nuclear free, and there were equally voices saying, look, this is going to jeopardize our relationship with the US, and that's too dangerous. So I think I guess I would just push back and say I think that there was more contestation, and that's not to say that the humble approach is never useful and it isn't good to engage, because I would also agree with elements of that. In particular areas, you do need to engage the opposition. But I just want to raise those examples because I think they test the limits, I guess, of the framework.
I think that's exactly what we need to hear and are here to do as well, testing the limits of the approach. Just one more question before we move on to the others. Then can you think of other kind of key challenges right now in the New Zealand context that the government isn't able to solve through kind of this bold moves? Or what are the sort of barriers you see there for implementing progressive policy? Sure.
I could speak for quite at length about this, so please cut me off if I go too long. A couple of things just for your listeners. Jacinda Ardern is our current Prime Minister, and she has a majority in Parliament. So she has very strong executive power. She has over 50% of the seats, and we only have one House, right? So there's no higher Senate. And in fact, some political commentators have called New Zealand's executive, one of the strongest in the world, of having unbridled power. In her previous term, 2017 to 2021, she didn't have that power. So in a way, it's a really exciting time for people on the progressive side to watch. However, there are massive problems that she and her government haven't been able to address in the first term or in this current term yet. And I'll name briefly racism. New Zealand's often held up as like this great shining light of race relations, and it's actually just not true. To give you a concrete example of that, we have one of the most targeted criminal justice systems in the world. So Māori currently make up 51% of the prison population, but they only make up 16.5% of the total New Zealand population. This is worse compared to what you see in the US around African Americans are overrepresented only 2.8 times. I mean, only, it's obviously terrible, but New Zealand it's 3.5 times. And there are many other examples I could give of how Māori are targeted, not just in the criminal justice system. And obviously racism goes beyond Māori. We've had, attacks on Muslims since the Christchurch attacks, Pacific Islanders. There's a real issue in New Zealand. And I think it's too easy to see, oh, everything works perfectly. We have massive problems of child poverty, youth suicide, mental health, climate change. New Zealand's often held up as a great example. And while the government has taken some steps forward, we're still not on track to meet our Paris goals. So I think there are very systematic problems, welfare, racism, climate change, that the government has made some steps, and maybe we can talk about that later. But these are very systemic problems, and I think I'll be interested to hear how other countries are managing to address them.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. They do sound like very familiar problems on, I guess, both sides of the pond and all over the world globally as well. Next to Portugal and to Tiago. Tiago, you also have a bit of background in research, but currently you have been working at the heart of government in Portugal. So I'm sure that some of these issues that Nina was describing and also Silva was going over, I'm pretty sure that they're pretty familiar to you as well. But from the sort of Portugal side of things, from that view, how does humble governance look like? Does it resemble like something that you've seen before or something that you are doing? And how are you tackling these sorts of polarizing problems in Portugal?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me in this panel. And thank you most of all for being able to learn a bit and get familiar with this concept of humble government, which I must confess I did not know beforehand. And actually, I do think it relates a lot to a lot of the things we are doing and experiencing here in Portugal. So it was very interesting to listen to Silva. And actually, the thing I would highlight is the agreeing to disagree part, which has been key to the success of our government, because the current government is based on the parliamentary support from the Socialist Party, which is a progressive center-left party. But since we don't have a majority, opposite to what happens in New Zealand, we do need to work across the aisle and find common ground with other parties. And we have done so since 2015, based on an formal/informal understanding with some parties to our left. And these are very different parties. Actually, this kind of political arrangement was something that, according to conventional wisdom here in Portugal, was never supposed to happen. It was impossible because we do have different views on many issues. We are not the same. We do not think alike on many issues. Nevertheless, what we have been able to do is, as I was saying, agree to disagree. So from the outset, we have said that there are a set of issues on which we will never reach an agreement, and that's okay. And we don't try to hide that. We state our differences very clearly, but we also say that this should not prevent us from working together in order to reach specific concrete goals that work for the people, that will be able to improve and have been able to improve people's lives. And so this concept of collaborating with those we disagree with, well, that's something we've been doing now since 2015. We have quite some practice on that. We disagree on a lot of issues, but we have been able to build bridges and find common ground. And it has worked for the good of the people in a set of different fields. And particularly because when we came into office, this is also something I would like to highlight. We came into office at a very difficult time after some very tough austerity measures. Portugal, after the financial crisis and the public debt crisis, had to endure a very tough adjustment program. And we were under an IMF and European Commission program. And the political discourse here in Portugal was something like, we had been living above our means. And so now we, the Portuguese people, had to atone for our past sins and had to suffer these very harsh austerity measures. And cutting the deficit was above all else. So these were hard times. And basically we were being presented with this TINA motto, that there is no alternative. And people were just fed up with that. And so when we came into office, we said, no. There is an alternative. There are alternatives. And if we are able to, break those gridlocks that have prevented us from, in the past, working together with other parties, particularly to our left, and if we are able to do that, then we can start to implement a different set of policies, get away with the neoliberal rule book, and that's what we did, based on very specific goals and policy measures that basically in the first phase were basically rolling back some of the wage cuts and tax hikes of that austerity period, and showing even the European Union that it worked, that this other alternative, not only it existed, but it worked because we had an economic recovery and the job market was regaining ground, and people were living, starting to live better off and having more income. So it's this, the fact that we were able to not just commit to our values and stand our ground in terms of our ideological thinking, but rather reach across the aisle and speak to others on which we do not agree on all matters, but with them being able to find solutions that work for the good of the common people. So this has worked. And I think in order to do that, we needed to be humble. So we, without knowing it, we were practicing this humble government framework, I guess, because clearly we understood that we couldn't do it alone, obviously. But if we did not reach across to these other political actors, then the alternative would be the prolonging of that austerity policy and those measures that we wanted to get rid of. So if we didn't want more of the same, we had to be humble and be able to talk to those and find, when with them, working with them, find on what issues we would be able to reach a common understanding. So that's basically what we've been doing. And being humble, as well, you might argue we were humble out of necessity because we didn't have a majority in parliament. Well, maybe you could argue that, but the fact is that being humbled has worked, and it has proven to be a great solution.
Thanks, Tiago. I like this, being humble out of necessity as well. There's a lot of similarities with the New Zealand case. Of course, like you said, this necessity to be humble is quite different. I just wanted to ask before we turn to Emily, then, is it enough that you said that you were being humble, but what about the other side? How do you get them to be humble as well? Because it takes two to tango, right?
Of course. Oh, absolutely. It takes two to tango. And so we both had to be humble, which is, I must say, a difficult process. I won't say it is easy because, as I stressed in the beginning, we are very different parties. We think very differently on a range of issues. And negotiations are hard and messy and tricky. Every year around the budget, for instance. Well, since 2015, we have been able to have our budget proposal adopted in Parliament. And this has meant that we had to give in on some things that we would like to do differently. And they also had to give in on some of their views. And so this has been a bilateral process indeed, in which sometimes it is difficult to sell that to our constituents, to traditional voters. But as a whole, the country, well, what polls tell us is that the country is happy with this dialogue that was seen as unlikely, impossible actually. And but people are happy that it has happened, that it is happening, and that it has been working for the past years.
All right, sounds good. We'll circle back to some of those points in just a bit. But before that, I'd again like to remind everybody that there is a Q&A function, so please do use that to pose your questions. And at the end, we'll leave a space for going through the questions and also getting the voice of the audience in here. But before turning over to a conversation between all of you, Emily, Nina already harked back to the status of the United States, and things are there very polarized, I might say, or have been. And you, at the heart, writing for many influential papers, I guess, have had a prime sort of observatory seat into looking at those things. But so, from the point of view of the US, how does humbleness sound like, and is that an option or a possibility?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's very humbling to be with this group of speakers. You know, I'm not in government or a political scientist. I'm but a journalist, and so my answers might be a little bit different than some of the others. But this sounds like a wonderful model for when everybody in the government can at least agree on the form of government that you want to have, right? Or that you're all on the same page about the fact that you want this to be a democracy. While I think that there might be places in state and local governments where this could work right now, because we're quite a federal system, I do not think that the United States is far enough out of crisis to adopt this model at this time. What I mean by that is, this is a really interesting moment for progressive politics in that, on the one hand, we just had this year where we saw that actually contrary to the past 40 years of American politics, actually people do want robust support from their government, right? And actually people do want a social safety net, and actually people do expect their government to be ambitious and to try to help them. At the same time as we have that, we have, and we know that this is just a trial run for other pandemics and for climate change, right? For arguably the great existential crisis of our time. And that is coming down the pike as well, and will need to be dealt with. At the same time, you have a federal government that is so partisan, so polarized, so whatever word you want to use, that we are not even, again, we are not even on the same page about whether or not we want to remain a democracy. I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, I don't mean to sound dramatic, but when one side says we would like every citizen to be able to vote, and the other side says we think that it's fine to put up state laws that make it more difficult for people, particularly Black Americans, to vote, that is not something where you can use this model, because we are fundamentally in disagreement about the end goal of this government, right? Is it to represent all Americans, or is it to protect the white minority that this country was founded to serve? If you could, like, they couldn't even get through the Senate a commission to look into what happened on January 6th when the Capitol building was stormed during the certification of the election. Like, that's pretty basic. And so it's not, you know, I take the point of this model being we have to recognize when we don't know everything, when we don't, and I think that's wonderful. But the issue here is not lack of knowledge. The issue here is completely contrasting worldviews. At the same time, there's this really interesting, depressing facet of American government, which is that as partisan as things are, there is still a valorization of bipartisanship in some corners of Congress. So rather than saying, well, the majority of Americans do want a robust infrastructure bill passed, or the majority of Americans do want voting rights, there's a line of thought by some in the Senate and in Congress more generally that says, well, we can only do this if there's bipartisan unity in Congress, right? So not unity with Americans generally, but unity by those elected to serve in Congress, who tend to be more representative of conservative America and more conservative themselves than the majority of the country. So basically, I think in order for this to work, in order for this system to be applicable to the United States, one of two things would need to happen. Either enough Republicans change their minds. And I don't mean to say like that all the Republicans are good, all the Democrats are bad. Joe Manchin from West Virginia is a Democrat who basically said, I won't vote for voting rights unless Republicans get on board, which they're not going to, right? So this is not just a Republican problem, but either some Republicans could change their minds and think, oh, actually, I've changed my mind as to the kind of country I want to live in and whether I want the people to elect their leaders, their presidents. Or alternatively, Democrats could do something that they don't look like they're going to do either, which is change the structures to make it more representative of the country, by which I mean abolish things like the filibuster that require 60 Senate votes, add senators for DC, get rid of the Electoral College, get rid of gerrymandering or tamp down on gerrymandering, which basically redistricts or creates district borders such that on both sides, more radical folks tend to end up in Congress. Failing that, I think that we are going to remain in, at least in the short term, in democratic crisis. And if you are in crisis, you cannot have, so long as we are not working with the same set of facts and the same like just reality, I do not see how on a federal level, the United States can adopt the humble governance model. Not to be
Thanks.
Lady Gloom,
Yeah.
but
yeah, it does seem difficult when one side is playing chess and the other one checkers. It doesn't really add up. I just wanted to ask, Nina was talking about sort of the boldness, the concept of boldness. And I think some of that maybe is what we've seen in some of the Biden policies. Do you see that kind of that we're so far along that this bipartisanship isn't even happening, that just the executive in power has the ability and has to, in order for progressive policies to advance, has to take that sort of bold stance on the things and kind of discard this bipartisanship in the first place?
Yeah, again, I think that in the United States, this goes back to what I was saying before, we kind of need to rethink what we mean when we say bipartisanship, right? Or what we say when we mean unity. does unity mean I'm serving most of my constituents? Does unity mean I'm doing the thing that Americans of both parties want me to do? Or does unity mean I'm waiting for 2 senators to get on board from the other side, right? Personally, I think that it should be the former, because if not, this country will remain in democratic crisis and also be at a standstill in terms of goods and services that people desperately need. The American system is an interesting one in many ways. One is that under the Constitution, the legislative branch has more power, but in practice over the past